Hello, everyone, and welcome to the EDHRECast. I'm Matt Morgan, and I'm joined by my co-host, who, if he and I went to a high school reunion, one of us would definitely be Romy, the other one would definitely be Michelle. It's Dana Roach. What's going on, buddy?
I had a joke here to tell about jumping rope, but I think I'm just going to skip it.
Tie that one off and throw it away. Good. Well played, sir. So we have a very special episode this week. I'm very, very excited for what we got to do this time around. But Dana, why don't you let everybody know?
Yeah, we had one of the biggest announcements in Commander history this week, the kind of change to how power levels will be evaluated. And we've had the kind of father of all of that on to talk about it, Gavin Verhey.
Yeah, we had an absolutely fantastic conversation, just wrapped it up, but we wanted to get everything taken care of ahead of time. So we're recording just to make sure we get all of our plugs in place and really focus on the interview with Gavin. It was a fascinating conversation. Absolutely. I'm super excited for everybody to get to hear it. But before we get into the interview, we got to tell everybody that the day this episode is releasing is 1 week away from MagicCon Chicago. We will be there. We will be in full force. All three of us. Joey will be there as well. And we're going to be doing something we've never gotten to do before. We're going to get to have a live panel at the event. And so make sure you come Sunday afternoon at 2:30 to Spin Down Room E351. That's where we're going to be hosting a popular segment you might know as Challenge of Stats. We're going to be able to do that live with an audience. We're going to have prizes to give away. So if you want to beat us at Challenge of Stats, this is your opportunity. So make sure you come in. We also have a meet and greet throughout the weekend. We'll be doing all sorts of fun things, especially with our partner Dragon Shield. So make sure you come to their booth if you want to see us as well. There's so much going on, but we want to make sure everybody knows, come to our meet and greet, come to the live panel that we're doing Sunday afternoon from 2:30 to 3:30.
And Matt mentioned Dragon Shield. We are excited to be allied with Dragon Shield. Their sleeve crafter tool at dragonshield.com is actually really quite excellent, and it lets you design personalized sleeves for your Magic collection. It's easy to use, and you can use basically any piece of art to make your sleeves unique to you and your deck. And if you click on the link in the description below, you get 5% off anything at Dragon Shield. It makes your products cheaper and it supports the show. Make your opponents yield with Dragon Shield.
Yeah, and if you would like to support the show, you can do so in lots of different ways beyond just clicking on the link over to Dragon Shield. You can like this video, you can subscribe on YouTube. Those are free ways to do that. Leaving a review on your local podcast app is also appreciated too. But if you would like to, you can head over to patreon.com/EDHRECast, where we have all sorts of patron tiers over there, whether you want to join our Discord community that is exclusive to our patrons, which I'm sure since this announcement has happened, our community has not stopped talking about it. It's been buzzing, I'm sure, with all these different things and all the implications of this massive announcement that's affecting the Commander format. So if you would like to do that and join that conversation, you can do that over at patreon.com/EDHRECast. And what you can also do is get your name in the running for the weekly patron shout out. So this week we want to give a super special thank you to Grant Thompson, who did not take it for granted. There it is. To going to patreon.com/EDHRECast to support us and joined in over on our Discord. So thank you, Grant, for all of that support. We definitely could not be doing this without you, without any of our patrons over there. So thank you very much.
Also, EDHREC has started doing a weekly interview show called What's Up, hosted by writer Andy Zupke at twitch.tv/EDHRECast on Tuesdays at 7 Pacific, 10 Eastern. He just had guests Rebel Blue and Brouhaha Gaming on, and for the rest of the month, we'll be talking to Ryan Nichols, also known as Tron is Bad, and Bobby Christine. So stop it and check that show out.
Awesome. Well, Dana, I don't think there's really much else we can say to lead up to this. Let's just get right into the interview, because I had a lot of fun getting to talk with Gavin, and let's cut right to it.
All right.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. And we're here. Dana, what's going on, buddy?
I'm looking forward to getting into this interview.
Same here. So everyone, we have a very special guest. We have the one and only Gavin Verhey. Gavin, welcome back to the show. And how's everything going?
Good to be here. I think it's only been 200 episodes or so since the last time I was on. So
yeah, I think a few years, 200 episodes.
Yeah, no problem. But glad to be here and really glad to be chatting with you guys. Obviously, a lot of stuff to talk about in regards to Commander, and so I thought, hey, how about I come on and let's chat about some of the stuff we've talked about recently.
Yeah, there was a little bit that happened recently this week even. We had a pretty massive announcement when it comes to Commander and just how players get to communicate about their decks. So, Gavin, can you just take us through real quick what happened and what exactly was this announcement that happened a couple days ago?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll just kind of take a step back in time a little bit. I'll just kind of set the stage. Maybe not everyone here is familiar with everything. So At the end of last year, toward the end of last year, there was bit of a hullabaloo that happened. And the end result of it, after a lot of discussion, was the former rules committee handed the commander format to Wizards of the Coast. But one thing that was really important to me was we kept it with the community. So I brought in a group called the Commander Format Panel. It's 16 different people that are all super deep in the Commander format from all walks of enjoying Commander to kind of work and iterate on stuff. Now, at that time, we talked about I showed off the very early bones of what we call the bracket system. It was matchmaking thing. Now, kind of like anytime R&D ever gives you insight into what we're working on at the time, what we're talking about early, it was in some very, very, very early stages. Sort of like if I have showed you a Magic set, 9 months before we finished it, it would also look a little unfinished.
Sure.
And so we brought in the format panel to work on it, and they did an amazing job. In the final announcement we made on Tuesday, which I'll get to here in a second, the final announcement we made on Tuesday, I can see DNA from literally every single person on that panel, and a thing they suggested, or an idea they had, or a suggestion they made. So it was totally a group effort, and it was very, very cool to see this whole thing come together. So there's a lot of iteration on it over time. The bracket system we talked about at the end of last year was quite a bit different. It had you picking cards, we would categorize, every card in Magic, a lot of cards in Magic, and the highest card in your deck would be equivalent to the bracket you were. It was complicated, it required a lot of cards, but it was in the right direction. And the reason why we were working on this was one of the biggest challenges as Commander has grown and grown and grown is finding games that you're happy to play in, right? Now, if you have your playgroup at home and you're enjoying it and it's great, that's awesome. In fact, with the announcement we made on Tuesday, I expect for most people, it won't change. They'll do what they always do. They sit down with their friends on every Tuesday night or whatever. They play Commander. They have a great time. They don't need to worry about this at all, and that's awesome. But as you go into game stores or conventions like MagicCons and the like, there's so many people, all with a different understanding of what Commander is, that creating a kind of common language and terminology is really, really meaningful. If you think about Commander, it's become the largest format in all of Magic, and the only terminology that's really been created is Rule 0 and CEDH. And so, and I guess power level 1 through 7, which we all know how successful that is. So, or 1 through 10, I guess, but we all know what you're choosing.
Power level, my deck is a 7.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's create some more terminology for folks to use. And that's kind of where this really came out of. So you don't have to use this. It's just a way to help you matchmake your Commander games. It is an extra tool in your tool belt. Hopefully it's a lot stronger than power level 1 through 10. And, we'll kind of see how things roll out. The other two caveats I just want to give on that we talked about a lot and are important is one, we can't stop people from lying to you. We talked about a lot of systems, but no matter what we do, we cannot stop people from sitting down and lying about what's in their deck. So if someone does that, don't play with them again. Give them a stern talking to, and whatever you want to do. And then number 3,
there's always going to be bad actors for sure.
Yeah, absolutely, and nothing you can do about that. But hopefully, this will help everyone who earnestly wants to find games. And then just the third thing is we spent time on this. We iterated. We made the best system we thought we could make, and that we were really happy with. But also, while we're very excited about it, we're sure it's not perfect, right? There's a lot of rooms for debates on tiny things, or even maybe some big picture things. So we're calling this Commander Brackets Beta. And the idea being here that we're going to debut it now, and we're going to take in all of your feedback. So literally, I'm sure, this is coming out on maybe Friday. We announced this on Tuesday. I'm sure by the time this comes out, there'll be no shortage of articles written and posts on social media made that will be giving us feedback. And we're also committing an area of Chicago to be able to really focus and test this out as well. So we're curious on folks' feedback to go in and tweak and make this better. So all feedback is welcome. And we're excited to learn in this beta process so we can then come back and roll out a more final version later on this year.
Yeah, I'm sure in the time that it happened between the announcement going live and this episode going live, your social media, just all your mentions have exploded. So hopefully you haven't stressed out too much by the time this episode is airing too.
Yeah, I'm sure that we'll answer a bunch of questions and talk about a bunch of things on this episode, and everyone watching will be like, ask the question that you and me and Dana have not even thought of yet, So we'll do our best, but can't predict what you're going to be talking about. We're going to record this and we'll see what happens.
Is this something that was entirely the genesis of this new group, or were there any tendrils from the previous RC and CAG that had been working on something that then evolved into this?
Yeah, so late last year, really in September-ish, is when we started talking about the earliest forms of this. And at that point, the rules committee was still there. And we started talking about a tiny bit with them. But it wasn't really anything. And then after, we had the very bare bones of it. And then when everything went down, we wanted to talk about kind of what we had at the time to show we had been working on something in this space. But really, I mean, you can see some through lines here. Like, it's called brackets. It helps you identify. It helps. It's about matchmaking and so on. But if you look at what we talked about, gave a little preview of toward the end of last year, and what we have today, a ton of that DNA is really coming from the Commander format panel. Now, the Commander format panel includes many people from the previous CAG and rules committee, so some of that DNA and ideas were there, bubbling around from those folks at the time. But I really want to give a shout out to the group because they did an amazing job on this. And while I wrangled everything together, and it's kind of like the person taking this idea and pulling them together, it was really the rest of the group and the community that did an amazing job spinning this up. So I want to give kudos to them for their hard work.
Yeah, I know you got a really good not scattering, but a good sample size of folks from all levels of the formats too. Because the format is, you mentioned, it's the most played format for all of Magic. There's just so much that goes into that, whether it's the super, super hyper casual folks into the CDH, the tournament level players. And I think you did a really good job of getting a very diverse team to feed in information from all aspects of just what Commander has grown to become.
It's really awesome that when I have a CDH question, I'm like, oh, what should we be doing for these folks? I can just tag Lua and Rebel and Deco, and they'll be like, oh, hey, let me tell you what I think, right? It's just a great resource to have kind of people at every level along the way that you can be like, oh, you're an expert in this, tell me what you think. Oh, hey, you like playing this deck, tell me what you think. Here's your philosophy, tell me what you think. And creating that panel with all those opinions has been really, really, really valuable. And I super appreciate that work. And, I know for them too, it's been a long journey here. I'm used to working on Magic where it takes years and years for the Magic sets I work on to come out, right? Final Fantasy is going to come out later this year. I was the lead designer and I've been working on that set for 4 years. Ooh. I'm used to the long journey. But for these folks coming in, who don't have that kind of history, I know that the gap of time from, September, October to where we are now, that's a long time for everything you've been talking about and working on to finally come out into the world. So I know a lot of them are pretty excited to see their first big thing that they've worked on go out into the public eye as well.
Yeah, I love that for you and the group. So Dana, why don't you real quick kind of walk us through, we'll make sure that we have the announcement listed and linked in the description below. If you haven't read that yet, probably want to make sure you give that a read because it covers pretty much everything here, but we want to give a little bit more details to Gavin. So Dana, walk us through the bracket system real quick because there's a lot that goes into those.
Yeah, so we're looking at basically breaking down the kind of power levels of Commander decks into 4/5 brackets. And the reason I say 4/5 is because the fifth bracket is CEDH. So that's kind of, I wouldn't say its own thing, but you're either playing CEDH or you're not. It tends to be a pretty binary situation. So that's the fifth bracket. The other 4 brackets, if you're not playing CEDH, are kind of dividing you up into what you're playing or what your goals of the game are. It's a combination of all of those things, I think, would be the best way to describe it. And one of the goals, I believe, I can't remember who said this, was to make sure we had an even number of brackets so people didn't kind of default to calling their deck something in the middle. Is that correct, Gavin?
Well, it was something we talked about last year. So there's been a bunch of studies on just when you create systems that have an odd number, just anywhere in the world, right? If you're polling somebody, if you're creating a system, whatever, a lot of people tend to gravitate toward the middle of something, right? So if you are making a survey, I always like using a 6-point scale or a 4-point scale instead of a 5-point scale or a 10-point scale, because a lot of people just default to 3. Now, sometimes you really want there to be a middle, but it's nice to make you choose a side, right? Either you like it a little bit or you dislike it a little bit, right?
Sure, yeah.
And with the bracket system, I guess I could talk about how we got to the number we got to, or maybe you want to say more. I don't know if you want me to kick back to you or.
Yeah, no. Why don't you tell us how you came up with that? Yeah.
Right. So we talked a lot about how many we wanted to have, right? And certainly that was part of my mind. And when we talked last year, when we first announced this bracketing system, we talked about it in 4, not 5. But we ended up 5 here for a couple of reasons. The first is, so we'll get into this in a little bit, but we created this thing called the Game Changer list. So the Game Changer list is sort of a list of cards that dictates where on the bracket you kind of fall. And we knew we wanted to have one category that was no game changers, one category that was some game changers, and one category that was all game changers. That was a really clean delineation for us. And once we got there, there's been a lot of talk in the community about how they want a level to play below the precon level. I'm playing my goofy deck. I'm playing my highly thematic Weatherlight crew deck. I don't want to play at the power level of precon. So it's okay, well, let's make something that's a little below that. Let's split those two up into 2. And I thought, honestly, those were the 4 we were going to have. And it's interesting you say 4/5, because that's kind of where we were for a little while, right? Of under a precon, at a precon, above a precon, and high powered. But one note I got from the CDH folks, and once again, I'm so grateful to have them, and I would have not thought of this myself, is they're like, I know that maybe to your mind, high-powered and CDH are synonymous, but they're really not, right? CDH is its own thing. You are playing at a power level that is higher, not necessarily just higher than high-powered, but you're thinking about a tournament structure and a meta game, and there's a whole mindset that goes into it, and a whole philosophy of what happens at a table, and so on. And I think, also, I think it was Lua that maybe made this point, which is that the one time in all of Commander history that a bracketing system has worked is with CDH, right? That is a thing, a word that we all know. When you say CDH, we know what that means. And so giving them giving CDH the fifth level here of like, hey, we're now quantifying some Rollins into our terms, I think it's just a nice nod toward the work that's gone into that format. So some people will look at it and say, well, there's kind of three categories, right? No game changers, some game changers, and all game changers. But we wanted to create a little bit of distinction between in the first bucket and the last bucket as to what kind of thing you're doing there. And that's how we ended up at 5. And I do think that in this system, like we've done a bunch of work on it, both on the panel and at Wizards, I was talking about where our decks would go and experimenting. Because there are some pretty good guidelines written around what you're looking for, there's less of that natural gravitation toward the middle and more like, hey, read these descriptions and see what kind of fits the magic you want to play. I do expect that the vast majority of decks, especially at the onset here, will be in brackets 2, 3, and 4. Bracket 1 being like the silly / thematic bracket, I think will have a lower percentage of people. And the CDH, of course, will have a lower percentage of people because that's super high powered tournament magic. A lot of folks aren't in for that. So I do expect a lot of folks to gravitate toward the middle there. But over time, maybe we'll see that spread out a little bit, right? Like I know for me, I've never wanted to build a silly deck that isn't focused on winning in my entire life. That's just not how I approach Magic.
Sure.
But the moment that you actually create a space for it, I'm like, oh, maybe that would be fun to have one of those decks if I can guarantee that I can play with people that are also doing the same thing, right? Because I don't want to sit down with my all unicorn in the art deck and face against someone's, turn 1 Mox Diamond, Ancient Tomb, Rhystic Study deck. Well, that's going to be a bad experience. But if I can sit down and be like, hey, I've got my unicorn deck, and you've got your Wizards with Pointy Hats deck, and there's the Weatherlight Crew deck, and this is the deck with everything costs 4 mana. Like maybe we have a funny time and we get to play and have that shared experience. So opening that up to me is actually pretty cool for the future of Commander, and maybe even let some folks go into that category, which I know many people have yearned for the days of like, before the current precon level. And I think that's a place you can go to and play in.
So to kind of continue that thought of, you had people from all across the spectrum. It sounds like that bracket 1, that's what was called exhibition in the article, where people are just kind of doing the thing you mentioned, like everybody's in a chair looking left and those types of homes for decks. And then level 2 is where those precons exist and where kind of the modern day precon, because we hear all the time, and I'm sure you hear even more than we do, that precons now are very different from precons even 5 years ago.
For sure. Yeah. When I did my review series with Melissa, you go back and look at the original precons and they are laughable, the cards that go into them.
They are rough.
They're very rough, even for the time. And I'd say that the key there, I think that's a good point, Matt, is modern day precon is at the core level. The average modern day precon, because there are some exceptions, right? Like Secret Lair Commander decks, my coin flip deck, I would not consider a bracket 2 deck. Some of the modern Horizons Commander decks, I would not consider a bracket 2 deck. But if you look at precons in aggregate, the average precon sits there, right? And so, I'm not expecting everyone to go out there and analyze our precons and build their decks, but there's kind of like a feel that goes with it. You kind of know what goes in a rough precon, I think, for a lot of it.
So, and then from there, you get into bracket 3, which is the upgraded field, which is decks performing better than precon. The big shift, though, into bracket 3 is where game changers start to come into play. And bracket 4, obviously, all the precon, or all the game changers, I should say, is where they kind of get looped into there. So we've mentioned a lot about these game changers. We've said a lot. I feel like we kind of need to give listeners that list there because we've talked a lot about them. So Gavin, what was the process into creating the game changers list?
Yeah. Okay. So we knew we wanted, we could talk about, I guess I'll start with in the article and maybe we'll get to it later in this episode. In every bracket, there's a bit of a description, right? Hey, here's kind of the gameplay we're looking for. And here's some things that go around it. Like, hey, in bracket 1, 2, and 3, no mass land denial, right? You don't want to get Armageddon. In brackets, in brackets 1, 2, and 3, don't be trying to chain your extra turn spells, that kind of stuff. But as much as we wanted to describe all of that and describe the experience, we also know that there's a section of players, Magic players, that really just need a list to look at. They're like, hey, here's a list I can look at and compare to. And I'm honestly that way too, right? I like being able to look at a list to understand things. And how many times have you heard a story of someone coming in and playing Commander and they build their deck in the most optimal way they can, full of all these powerful cards, and then they sit down, people are like, oh, that's not the Magic I wanted to play against, right? So having a list of cards quantified, we thought was really important. Now, we went through a lot of different systems. Like if you go back and look at what we talked about all the way back in September, October, that was like going to be taking tons and tons of cards and bracketing all of them. And it was going to be very convoluted. You're going to have to like know where they all went and et cetera, et cetera. And so as we began iterating and talking about it, what we really settled on being a good guiding light for this whole thing was one list. Could we create one extra list to refer to? So you've got the ban list and you have this list. And that one list is the sort of additional voice of truth here. So you're not like looking around and trying to figure out at all, 5 different lists and where they all stand. And then also trying to keep it not super long, right? Because it is an extra thing you have to check against. And there are amazing tools like Archidect and Scryfall that can hold all this stuff for you. But ultimately, like if the list is 400 cards, it's going to just become so onerous to look through and understand. So we wanted to keep it kind of short. And our target is funny. When we started talking about this whole thing, our target was 40 cards. And purely by coincidence, we ended up at exactly 40 cards. We went up and down and debated a lot of cards. And at the end of the day, when the dust settled, it was pretty wild that we actually ended up at literally exactly 40 cards. So it might move up and down in the future. Okay, so we wanted to create an additional list of cards. And so we created the Game Changers list. The idea behind the Game Changers list is it's sort of like combination watch list. So, hey, these are really strong cards that you should know exist. If you play them, maybe not everyone wants to opt into that kind of gameplay experience. And also, if we are to ban cards in the future, which I'm not saying we're going to ban a ton of these cards. Like I don't want people to get that part into their heads. But if we do ban cards in the future, they'll likely come off this list so that you kind of know, hey, these are cards we're looking at we know are really powerful, right? I think no matter how you feel about the Mana Crypt and Jeweled Lotus bans, one of the biggest things from the community that was felt by everybody was just how surprising they were, that they just came out of nowhere. And having a list of like, hey, these are the 40 cards that we know are at the upper end of the format, I think will really help with just broad forecasting that a little bit. Now, we still don't, you're not going to wake up one day and just be like, oh, Gaia's Cradle's banned out of nowhere. Like we definitely still want to broadcast this stuff and let you know what's happening here. But I think having this baseline to look at will be really meaningful. The other thing it lets us do is it kind of gives us a half step between banning a card and allowing it to be legal in all forms of Commander, right? If there are very powerful cards out there, they can kind of go onto this list and let the folks who want to play with them at the higher level, at CDH and high-powered, play with them, while letting folks just want to play their super casual decks not have to interact with them as much. And similarly, it creates a stepping point down from the ban list. So one of the things we're going to look at after this debuts is what cards can come off the ban list, and we'll have an update for you on that in probably late April. But if this works, and maybe by now we'll have an idea of that, in the next month we'll certainly have an idea of that, we'll be able to look at the ban list and pull off a number of cards potentially to then put on the Game Changer list. So we can bring something down so it's not messing up at maybe the more casual tables where it was causing trouble when it was initially banned, but it's eligible for the high power and CDH environments where maybe it's not as much of an issue. So I think it's a really nice half step. And honestly, it takes a bit of inspiration from a few things, including Canadian Highlander, right? It's sort of like a point system. If you imagine that every card is worth exactly 1 point. And I guess that was a long preamble. But the moral of the story here is there's this list of 40 cards. At bracket 1 and 2, you can include none of them in your deck. At bracket 3, you can include up to 3 of them in your deck. And at bracket 4 and 5, you can include unlimited of them in your deck. So there's like none, a little bit, and all as kind of a nice distinguishing factor there.
Well, since we're talking about it, I might as well go through and list all these cards on the Game Changer list. And these are organized by color identity, more or less. So we have Drannith Magistrate, Enlightened Tutor, Sarah's Sanctum, Smothering Tithe, and Trouble in Pairs as the white color identity cards. A Cyclonic Rift, Expropriate, Force of Will, Fierce Guardianship, Ristic Study, Thassa's Oracle, Urza, Lord High Artificer, Mystical Tutor, and a Jin-Jitaxis Core Augur as the blue color identity cards. Bolus of Citadel, Demonic Tutor, Imperial Seal, Opposition Agent, Turgid, God of Fright, Vampiric Tutor, and Ad Nauseam as the black cards. Jessica's Will, Underworld Breach, Gaia's Cradle, Jessica's Will and Underworld Breach as the red cards. Gaia's Cradle, Survival of the Fittest, Vorinclex, Voice of Hunger, as the green cards, and then Artifacts, the One Ring, Trinisphere, Chrome Mox, Grim Monolith, Lion's Eye Diamond, Mox Diamond, Mana Vault, Ancient Tomb, Glacial Chasm, Tabernacle at Pendrell Vale as the lands or colorless cards, and then Kinnan Bonner Prodigy, Eureka Tiger's Shadow, Winota Joiner of Forces, and Grand Arbiter Augustin IV as the kind of multicolored cards here.
Yeah, so we just named off a lot of cards, and everybody out there, some of the most powerful cards, most played cards in the format. So Gavin, getting that list down to 40 cards, I'm sure that there was a ton of debate back and forth. What are some cards that you just automatically knew, like, these are going on the list?
Yeah, I mean, kind of the table stakes are like Rhystic Study, Smothering Tithe, Cyclonic Rift are always like the example cards that I used, right? Just because they're some of the ones that are the most talked about cards in the format. Quite often, people are always chatting about these three cards in particular. And so those are just always my table stakes examples of like, hey, these are the kind of cards we want to look at. And really, when you go down that list that Dana just read off, I'm sure as he said all the card names, you're like, yep, that one makes sense. Yep, that one makes sense. Kind of like, yeah, this is the card. These are kind of cards that are like really endemic of high-powered commander. There are, so there's some that are at or not even endemic of high-powered commander, but endemic of like when they come down, they change the game. There's a reason we call it the game changers list, right? Your opponent plays a Rhystic Study or Smothering Tithe, and you're like, okay, we know what we're in for now, And there's maybe a few that are more for play pattern. Like I think a very interesting one that we debated back and forth a lot was Force of Will. Now, Force of Will is not, it's not, like that one to me is very close to the line. We debated as to if it should or shouldn't be on for a long time. But, strong free counter spells are the kinds of things that can really impact the way the game feels, right? You tap out to play your commander and they just cast this and your commander is gone, even though they're tapped out too. So there's some that were kind of on the borderline there. I'm sure there'll be all kinds of debate in the days to come as to what should be on here and what shouldn't be on here. And maybe there are cards that we excluded that should be, right? Yeah, there's definitely some table stakes. The other thing we wanted to roll in at the beginning were a bunch of the strongest tutors, because although we do have some guidance on tutors in each bracket section. In general, tutors like really create a lot of consistency in games, make the same cards come up over and over and over again. And while they themselves don't inherently change the game, like you guess the Monarch Tutor and the board state looks exactly the same for a second, it helps you find the card that is going to be the strongest thing to do.
Yeah.
And tutoring for your game changers is, of course, would be a very strong thing to do as well. So tutors are also from the very beginning things that we talked about limiting on here.
Yeah, I can definitely appreciate putting the tutors on there just because what they do to the game too. They slow the game down because, people are searching, shuffling, doing all that. Definitely slows the game down. So I like the consideration and I appreciate that thought process on tutors specifically, because that's one thing I feel seems to be contentious, especially in that kind of lower half of the spectrum for commander players.
Yeah, and they're not all on there, right? Like Worldly Tutor gets a pass, right? Worldly Tutor finds a creature, which tends to be a little bit safer, a little more interactable, a little less combo oriented. But we're going to see, right? There's also some guidance in the bracket levels on 1 and 2 about playing few tutors. Sort of like how when we build our precons, we put very few tutors in them. So we'll kind of see how that all gels, right? Like there's going to be a lot of feedback from folks in the next month, or probably in the past 72 hours. And I'm sure it is possible, a plausible outcome to me, is that they're like, hey, actually, you don't need the tutors on this list. We feel like the tutor notes that are on bracket 1 and 2 do enough to curb the amount of tutors, right? And maybe if you play a single demonic tutor in your bracket 2 deck, it's totally fine. But we're gonna kind of see what people's reactions are to that. And I can imagine more tutors going on. Like, hey, actually, would you tighten it up a little bit? Would you put Gamble on here? Would you put Worldly Tutor on here? Or loosening it a little bit.
Yeah.
Hey, let's take these tutors off and just know that the note about few tutors already does enough work. But we'll start it this way and kind of see what people's opinions are. And that's, once again, we're calling it a beta and using the feedback from the community, which, once again, Commander is a community-focused format. That's why I want to hear from all of you to guide the exact direction of cards that go on here. And yeah, I'm sure that many creators, probably yourselves included, will have videos and articles out about, ooh, here's what should be on, here's what shouldn't be on. And I'm excited, frankly, to go through and read all those and have the same debates that we all had.
Tons of debate for sure.
Yeah, because like in regards to the tutors, there's tutors on the list despite there being a note about which tutors run per brackets versus like land control, land destruction kind of stuff, which is kind of implicit. There's no stasis on this list or winter orb on this list because they are kind of covered in individual brackets where we're trying to avoid things that prevent people from using their lands.
Yeah, so the journey of mass land destruction is actually a pretty interesting one. So we all knew from the get-go, okay, if we're gonna make these brackets, first thing we want to do is make sure that people aren't playing LD spells, right? Because I'd say that is the most consistent and most mutually agreed on and understood thing of like, hey, if I'm playing Commander, I don't want to get Blood Moon or Armageddon or whatever.
Oh yeah,
right? Like everyone kind of agrees on that, except for the folks playing the most high-powered Commander. But it was never been written anywhere. So I've heard so many times of people coming in to play Commander, they maybe even come from a competitive background. They're like, great, I looked at the ban list, I'm gonna go build my deck, and they're like, put all these cards in there, and then they have to be told, hey, no, actually, we don't use those cards. And it's like, but how is that supposed to know that? Where is it supposed to point to learn they're not playing these things,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
I'm sure we've all heard a story like this. So we knew we wanted to quantify that in somewhere. So the first thing we did is when we work on the initial game changers list, we just rolled all those cards in there, right? We rolled in all the Mass LD cards in there, and it had Winter Orb, Blood Moon, all the ones you recognize. But the thing is, there's a ton of cards on that list that technically count that no one is really cast in Commander. Like Epicenter is a card I don't really see played very much. There's some weird old cards that like Ritual of Subdual, maybe that's the card name, like makes all your lands tap for colorless mana, has cumulative upkeep 4. And it's like, where do you draw the line on this, right? Like which cards do you decide to go on here? We know Stasis and Blood Moon, Armageddon, and all those should have it, but where do you draw the line? But we don't want any of them there because we don't want people to be like, well, hey, Armageddon's banned, but Catastrophe is 6 mana, so that's fine, right? It's like, no, let's put them all on a list. So then what we decided to do was, and that ballooned the game changers list, right? It would basically make it like double in size if we had that, so it makes it seem even larger. So then what we did next is, okay, let's just make a mass land destruction list. So we have the game changers list and the mass land denial list. Those will both live together, and then you'll just know that they're both there and both exist. So we then made a separate list. We looked through all the cards and made a separate list of whatever, the 38 or something cards that fall on that list. And that's how it was for a really long time. But kind of as we got into the fine-tuning stage of everything, well, for us, we're like, yeah, shortcut. No mass land denial. Here's the list. Here's the game changers list. The people approaching it, seeing this for the first time, it was right back to, hey, there's 2 lists and there's like 80 cards between them. So even though we knew we didn't need to look at that list, someone approaching it for the first time might be like, wow, this is a lot to actually take in. Because if you don't, inherently know what mass land denial means, or don't understand which cards that immediately disqualifies, it just looks like another long list to look through. So kind of one of the last changes we made to the system was just rolling it in with stuff like tutors and extra turns. I'm just like, hey, at brackets 1, 2, and 3, no mass land denial. And it's a bit on the player to understand what that means, but we think most people will understand what that means, right? Don't blow people's lands, don't keep them tapped. We did set the heuristic of destroy, usually 4 or more lands per player. And is there a little bit of squishiness there instead of a list? Yes, right? Like Fall of the Thran is a great example. Does Fall of the Thran count as mass land denial? Well, I don't know. It depends on if you're planning on destroying your Fall of the Thran or not before it finishes resolving, right? Does the Silex count as mass land denial? Everyone stacks down to 6 lands? Probably not. Like, it's pretty unlikely everyone's going to have 10 lands in play, so this will kill 4 lands per player. So there's a bit of judgment on players' parts still required. Like, it's clear Armageddon and Winter Orb are zeros. You can get a little more squishy about a card like Fall of the Thran, but ultimately, I think that people can judge as to if their deck is intending to blow up all folks' lands. And frankly, look, if you sit down and you play your first game and you blow up everyone's lands, I would hope, and you're playing at bracket level 2 or something, I would hope everyone at the table is like, hey, that wasn't really what I signed up for. And that's a learning moment for you, right? So I don't think that'll happen very often. I think for the most part, people will just get not to play these cards the same way that most Commander players get not to play them now. But it was really important to have that written and quantified somewhere.
I would also say in defense of that thought process, there's not a lot of difference in terms of like you playing the game between a 4 mana land destruction spell and a 6 mana mass land destruction spell. There's a pretty massive difference between a 1 or 2 mana demonic vampiric tutor and a 5 or 6 mana tutor for the most part, and how that impacts the game.
Absolutely right. There's actually there's an idea that was given that I really liked of like. What if we set mana cost values for tutors, right? And these brackets were like, oh, at this, you can't play 1 and 2 mana tutors, but 3+ mana tutors are fine. And that kind of evolved into where we got, because what we realized is all the strongest 1 and 2 mana tutors we would just put on the list, right? So we just put Demonic Tutor and Missile Tutor there. And that still leaves, like, you want to play Fabricate, you want to play something really narrow like Steel Shaper's Gift. Those are still on the table. But, maybe there's other heuristics we'll have to end up using there in the end. But my hope is we're able to see what works and what doesn't work and loosen things a little bit as opposed to tightening things up. But I'm sure there'll be some amount of tightening, some amount of loosening that will have to happen. And that's what happens. But directionally, I feel like we landed in a pretty good spot. I think also, one of the things we did was we wanted to lead with kind of the philosophy of each bracket. And in the article, you'll see that each section starts with the philosophy of what you expect in that bracket. And while there are some like rules in the deck building section, I think that philosophy does a lot toward like, okay, I can envision what goes here, right? This is about level of precon. You're not going to see games end out of nowhere. I can see what goes there. Oh, this is the goofy tier where you've got theme decks and it's based on art or story or whatever. I can understand what goes there, and it was actually really cool. I shopped it around to a lot of folks in the office because we talked about it a lot on the panel, and I wanted to make sure that folks at Wizards saw it. And one thing I did that I thought that I would like to do as a good litmus test is I sent it to a bunch of people who are not super into Commander. Like they play some on the side. They're only maybe even light Magic players. I'm just like, is this understandable? Do you understand what we're doing here, right? Because if the game designers and the folks on the panel can understand it, that's one thing. We think about Commander all day, every day.
Yeah.
But can someone who only plays a little bit of Magic or a little bit of Commander understand this? And I remember it was so reassuring when I sent it over to one of them, and they're like, I'm clearly a bracket 1 player. Like I like playing my deck based around things with fire on them, and I'm like, awesome. You read this, you immediately understood what you're like, and then they sent back like this gif of like looking terrified. One person did looking terrified. They're like CDH, and there's like terrified face, right? And it's like even someone that has never played a CDH game or interacted with a CDH person in their life can read these 5 and understand what they're signing up for and what they want to play in. So I'm hoping that is a good litmus test for the community at large. But we will see what happens. The one thing that's been very interesting throughout this whole process is we've never in the history of Magic tried anything like this. Right? We've never been here. Is this matchmaking system? It is official for folks who want to use it. Go try it out. There's been a lot of different tournament organizers that have tried things out like at events in the past, and there's been all kinds of people online who have tried certain systems, but there's never been like, hey, let's really put rigor and effort and testing and data into trying to create this thing. So this is really new. It's a new experiment, and I'm excited. I'm really excited to see how people receive it and how it goes over. I'm sure that some folks will be in right away. Some folks will be like, that's the most ridiculous thing ever. I'm not interested. A lot of people in the middle, and then we'll find out as people actually start trying the system how it works and what needs to be fine-tuned.
Yeah, I know that you are looking for feedback, and I think you probably have heard a lot of it by now, but I think one thing that you have done a very, very good job of that you kind of hit towards a little bit is there's a lot of unwritten rules in Commander, and you're trying your best to make it accessible and communicate the kind of the social contract with people that might be getting into the format. I think that's one thing that stuck out to me originally when seeing this is, it's kind of taking all those things that people never really say, but you need to know, and giving that to newer players.
Totally. I mean, and unwritten social contract rules are great for when a format is smaller or a group of players is smaller, but the more bigger it gets and the more people are constantly entering, the more that just becomes a barrier to entry, and people don't hear those rules, right? And especially when you have events like MagicCon, where we've got 15,000 people or whatever coming from all across the country from their little play group, where their play group has their own rules. Having a shared language to talk about this is great. There's all kinds of ways this could go. But one of the biggest things that I'm just excited about is giving folks more language to use. Being able to sit down at a table and even just being like, hey, how many game changers are in your deck? Even if you're not talking about brackets, just be like, how many game changers are in your deck? That's a great conversation, right? Oh, I've got 3 in my deck. You've got 12 in your deck. Well, that tells me something right there, It's not a perfect heuristic. There's all kinds of strong decks that have no game changers. But I think anything that gets folks sitting down and just talking about what kind of game they're about to play is already a win, right? I mean, kind of, I say this in the nicest way possible. It is not intended to be like, I'm tricking you, but like anything I can do to trick you into having the conversation at the beginning of the game about what you want to play is a win in my book, right? So even if you're like, use pieces of this for your group, that's great, and that's useful, I think.
So you're incentivizing players. You're not tricking us. You're incentivizing us. There we go.
Right.
There we go.
Right. Just like create. I just want to give you those tools. Right. I just want to give you language so you can sit down and be like, here's the kind of game I'm looking for. And to that end, one thing I call this on the article as well, but in general, yes, if you were able to find an all bracket 2 game, that's great. Everyone's gonna have a little different idea of what that is, but you can play within one bracket of you pretty safely, right? Like if you play a 2 against a 1 or 2 against a 3, it's not maybe gonna be perfect, but it'll be pretty okay, right? And that's kind of how a lot of things go right now.
Yeah.
A lot of the most challenging games of Commander are when you have 1s and 2s playing against 4s, and that's when you get to oh man, this guy, I wanted to play a nice little game of Commander, and I just got Ancient Tomb, Rhystic Studied, Armageddon, and that's what we really want to avoid. And so there's a little bit of wiggle room there too of oh, you've got a bracket 3, I've got bracket 2, great, we can hang together. I think that's true for the most part.
So in regards to the game changer cards, so they're presumed to not show up in bracket 2, and bracket 2 is where precons, at least the current state of precons, are supposed to land. Does that mean that the versions of game changer cards are less likely to appear in future precons? So like in the past, we've gotten Fierce Guardianship in a precon or Jessica's Will reprints or something. Are we going to expect to probably not see those moving forward?
Yeah, so I covered this a little bit in the article, but I'll talk about it a bit more here too. So first of all, we kind of have to see how this goes, right? We're not doing anything on the design side right now because we want to see what happens here. But the thing I want to stress is a few things. First of all, 2 is the average modern day precon, but there's plenty of places for outliers there. Like for example, Secret Lair Commander decks, Modern Horizons or Horizon style commander decks, like those can have very different things than the mainline ones in general. And I also I expect that in the real world there will be some amount of rule zeroing. There'll be some amount of hey, look, I'm playing this 2-level deck, but I do include Yuriko in there. It's not my commander. I'm just playing a cool ninja typal deck. This is in my 99. Is that cool with you guys? So I think there'll be some of that happens, and some of that we can maybe bring to here, right? So if we did a ninja precon, I think having Yuriko in there is a reasonable thing to at least consider as part of the 99, right? Hey, it's not your commander, but you're playing it in your 99. But we'll kind of see how that all breaks down, right? And maybe people stick really hard and fast to this, and we do want to be more careful about that and only expand it, and not put those in our 2 decks. One thing that I do think, though, is if this does get adopted pretty widely, I think we can start releasing precons that even have at the back of the box what bracket they're in. So, I think that is a pretty cool, unique thing we could do. Imagine we release one set of precons that's all bracket 1, and there are these goofy themes. You get to sit down, have a fun social experience. That's cool. I think we could also release a set of precons. Hey, these are all bracket 3 precons, or even some maybe we even go all the way. Hey, we're finally doing it. We're making. You want to play high-powered commander? Here's 4 bracket 4 precons that go crazy. And to me, I think that's a really cool opportunity to do some different stuff. So, while I think within a biodome, within 4 decks, it'd be just like how we're trying to matchmake you. It'd be good if all 4 were the same level. I could imagine a world where if this takes off, we do put this on the back of the precons, and that gives you an indication as to what you're kind of signing up for. So there's a place to reprint those after all. But the moral of the story is we'll have plenty of places to put cards like Jessica's Will and Fierce Guardianship and Trouble in Pairs. We're not going to have a lack of places to put these cards. So we'll make sure there are places to roll them out. And there will be cards in the future, I'm sure, because we're making plenty of Magic cards that will show up in precons and end up on this list. Our goal is not to make those. We are not setting out to be oh, great, now that the Game Changers list exists, let's go and make more cards that can go on it. That's not what we want to do, but it's just going to happen, right? More cards will show up over time that will end up on this list. Some of those will come from precons as well, because that's just the nature of Magic, right? You look at the list of cards on there, and Trouble in Pairs came out last year, and as the data on EDHREC will tell you, it is a quite powerful Magic card. So it goes on there already. It does not exclude us from putting it in precons or other places in the future. Yeah.
So you mentioned cards showing up in precons like Trouble in Pairs. Do you think with the Game Changer list, you're going to have cards that are going to be added to give the Game Changer list upon release? Because I struggle to think that, the One Ring, everybody kind of knew going out. And I'm sure in the design process, you wanted the One Ring to be a very, very powerful card to symbolize what it does in the lore. Do you think that you're going to have cards that are released and you add to the Game Changer list out the box? Or are you going to kind of give them time to breathe and see if they earn that kind of spot on the list?
Yeah, I would be pretty surprised if anything we put directly on the Game Changers list, because I think we're trying to just not make cards in that category, right? As I said earlier, we're trying not to design Game Changers. We've got a great commander design team that is putting cards through its paces and through the rigor to try and make sure that they stay balanced in a game of Commander. The only time I could see doing that is if we release a card that is such a close comp to a card that's already there that we know inherently it's going to be an issue. I'll give you a great example. So last year on the Pauper format panel, so the very other side of this, Cranial Ram was in Modern Horizons 3, which is basically the same card as Cranial Plating but better. And Cranial Plating is a card that is banned in Pauper. So it's it doesn't take a rocket scientist to tell you this card is going to be a problem right out of the gates. We'll put it there. Yeah. So I'm not saying we're going to make this card, because I would, if I saw this card in a file, I'd be like, no, please change your card. But if we made Smothering Tithe 2 that was exactly Smothering Tithe, but it was, green or whatever, once again, not a card we're going to make, it would make sense to me that we'd put it on the list right away, because hey, we all know what this is going to do. Smothering Tithe is here, this card is also going to be here, right? But we're not really making cards like that. We're intentionally trying to not make cards like that. So I would be pretty surprised if that happens. What I expect the way it would work is the set comes out, we see how the set plays out, we see how things are reacting, we look at the data, we honestly would probably talk with the folks at EDHREC about what the adoption rate of cards looks like, listen to community sentiment, and then in the next update, which I'm hoping we get to either quarterly or every 6 months or so, updates where we can nudge things up and down the Game Changers list, we do that. So if you look at a way that it could have looked like, let's take Modern Horizons 3 as an example. Let's imagine that we wanted to move Nadu to the Game Changers list instead of banning it outright. It would be, set comes out, we certainly didn't know Nadu was going to be a problem. Oops. So the set comes out, we see how it is, and 3 months later or whatever, we're like, hey, we're putting this onto the Game Changers list, is how I envision that going. Nadu, and I use Nadu as my example. Nadu is such an extreme case. I could imagine a world where it goes straight to the ban list. I don't think anyone would be sad about it. Nadu can be chucked into a fire for all I'm concerned. But in general, we're not gonna make a lot of Nadus. At least I hope not.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of the cadence you'll see of a card comes out and oh, 3 months later, it's rotated up here. I would not expect that to happen with every set. And I would expect there to be some amount of rotating up and down cadence, right? Like maybe we start with Force of Will on this list, and people are like, I don't really think it's that big of an issue, and we end up moving it down over time. So once again, that's why I really like having this half step here of hey, this list indicates that it's powerful and that you should see it at higher powered commander, but it's not in the lower powered games. Maybe over time we learn, it's actually fine, or we want to bring this down, or what have you.
Yeah, so what about cards like Lutri then, that they're not designed with Commander in mind, they're designed with 60 card formats in mind, but then they still end up, just the way that the mechanic interacts with Commander specifically, is that going to be more of a consideration too then? Because that's the only time we've had a card pre-banned was because of Lutri and just inherently not interacting with the Commander deck building rules.
Yeah, I mean, Lutria is a very unique example. As you said, it's the only time in the history of Commander this has happened. So I would be pretty surprised to see this happen again.
Sure.
In the case of Lutri, what happened is we had on the Wizards Design reached out to the Commander Rules Committee at the time to talk to them about this card. Like we literally had a conversation about the specific card and decided to pre-ban it simply because it would go in literally every single blue-red deck that has ever existed and it'd be completely ubiquitous. And it's just kind of a bummer to know that every blue-red deck for the rest of time should have this card.
Yeah.
So it was bad for that reason. It would be very surprising to me if there was any card that we ever made in all of Magic that was at that level, because it exists outside the game, right? Even if there's a card that's very powerful, like Arcane Signet or Command Tower, okay, it's taking up a spot in your 99 cards. But Lutri is a very strange mechanic, a very rare case of like, it takes up no spot in your deck, it is just free to play.
Yeah.
So I would be really surprised if we did anything like Lutri in the future. I doubt we would pre-ban any card. I guess, once again, I would use my Cranial Ram example, right? If there's a card that's already on the ban list this is exactly the same as, I could see pre-banning it, but I would put it pretty unlikely. And as I said, we are not going to use this as an excuse to make cards that would go straight to the Game Changers list. We don't want to do that.
Sure.
So because of that, I think it's unlikely that would happen with either the ban list or the Game Changer list. But who knows? There's a lot of weird words we can write on Magic cards, so anything is possible.
Well, and the reality is, like, it just takes a lot of reps sometimes to realize the impact of cards. Every set that comes out, you see people posting about, oh, this card's going to have to get banned, it's going to be broken, and 3 weeks later, everyone's forgotten that was potentially a problem. I remember seeing somebody on Reddit one time doing some rough math and saying that, like, the first Friday night of a first set's pre-release, the cards see more play than they do in the entirety of design and testing at WotC combined, just because of the math. I mean, the sheer amount of people playing those cards just dwarfs what you guys can conceivably do in the best of circumstances. So it's like the reality is that sometimes you just don't know how these cards are going to work until they actually hit the table and get a bunch of reps, and that's just how it's going to be.
One of the things that folks have really stressed to me, and I really taken to heart, is Commander moves slow, and it should move slow, right? Like with competitive formats, we have to take action on cards quick sometimes. It's like, hey, there's Pro Tours and there's tournaments all around the world, and this card's really messing up the format. We got to take action. And one thing that I really want to focus on with Commander, and has really been imparted into me, is you don't need to act fast. You can take your time. You can see how things come out and evolve. Play groups, if a card is a problem, already have a method of just being like, hey, can you not play that? It's pretty easy to do. And we can kind of see how things work on a long timeline, see how popular a card gets adopted, see how it shows up in the EDHREC numbers, see how the conversation is. We don't need to take fast action, right? So to me, the part of the reason why it's so unlikely is I would, in almost all cases, unless it is truly a direct comp, I would rather just see how it plays out and let that naturally evolve and see it bear out in reality. Because even if it is a huge issue, people just say, hey, don't do that, and that kind of it's not a tournament setting, right? So unless you're a CDH player, I suppose. So we have the time to let that evolve in the way that you don't otherwise. And I think Nadu is actually a good example of this, right? Like Nadu came out, people figured out in the first week and a half it was a busted and a half commander. People got their kicks in playing their deck one time, and then everyone was like, you flip over Nadu as your commander, and you're like, actually, could you not? And it just kind of naturally goes away.
Right.
That's why, on the Game Changers list, there are a couple legends on there. There's I think 5, maybe 6 legends on the Game Changers list in total. And we really tried to only put ones on there that we felt they're the ones that when someone flips it over, you are like, okay, I know what we're in for this time. It's going to be a super high powered game and maybe not the kind of Magic I want to play. And there's not a lot of ways to build them fair. I'll use Grand Arbiter is my example, right? No one's like, oh, I've got my fun, casual, we all enjoy having a good time Grand Arbiter deck. It just doesn't exist. That's not a thing that's out there. If you flip over Grand Arbiter, we all know you're going to be taxing people. It's just what the card does. And so we try to be pretty judicious about what went on that list when it came to Legends. There's a couple that are on the line to me, like Eureka is maybe on the line. It's like really powerful, but maybe you can use it in more fair ways. But yeah, stuff like Kinnan or Grand Arbiter is like, if you're someone flips over as their commander, you kind of know what's going on, right? So we want to be pretty judicious about that. And with Nadu, I think we see it bore out, and it got kicked out of the format.
I mean, I appreciate the special consideration for Turgid. That's the only commander in the past couple of years that I've like actively opted out of playing against. Is that card does so many things that just like take the agency away. So I'm glad to see that getting recognized, because I've been on that train for a while though.
Yeah, there's not a lot of time someone's like, oh, I've got my fun for everyone casual Turgid deck. It's like I would be surprised. Maybe someone out there listening right now has it, but surely that's not the average use case. But there's a lot of ones that were on the line for us.
Yeah,
where there are fun ones. Like I'll give you a great example. A card that is not on this list is Atraxa, right? The 4 mana Atraxa,
sure,
right? That card's really powerful. That card fuels some very strong decks, but ultimately there are a lot of fun decks out there that use it, right? Like you can have your goofy counters deck or your Planeswalker Atraxa deck that is like really thematic and fun, and we don't want to take that away from people. But it's the Kinnans and the Urzas of the world where like, yeah, we all kind of know what you're doing here that we wanted to put there. So we'll see what happens. Like Edgar Markov was a card we talked about, but ultimately is not on the list because a lot of very casual Vampires decks like using Edgar. So we'll see what happens with this list as it evolves. I can imagine some Legends coming off, some Legends going on. But, I'll be curious to see the feedback from the community.
I actually played against a Atraxa horror deck a few years back, and that was even before we got good horrors recently. It was a deck filled with a bunch of really bad horrors, and it was a super fun deck because, just seeing all these terrible cards under an Atraxa deck, that was a lot of fun. So yeah, no, I'm with you on Atraxa. That is one of those high-powered, super popular commanders that you also see people doing goofy stuff with.
Yeah, for sure. And so we'll see how that evolves, because maybe there's enough people who are like, no, I have a fun Grand Arbiter deck. Trust me that we change our minds. But yeah, the one thing that's interesting about the Legends, and we talked about this a lot and debated it, is Legends are the one thing in Commander that you do know before the game starts. So like to your point, Matt,
sure.
if someone flipped over Turgid, you can just be like, I'm good. And move on. So maybe they don't need to be on this list at all, but we wanted to quantify a few of them, and we'll kind of see how that goes.
So do you have any concerns that there's going to be the version of my deck's a 7 with this bracket system?
Well, I do think a lot of folks are going to converge on 2, 3, and 4, right? Like I said earlier, I think 1 and 5 will be the least represented.
Sure.
And specifically, I think a lot of folks will converge on 2 and 3 as kind of, I do have game changers, I don't have game changers. It's kind of a thing. But unlike power level 1 through 10, where you're trying to be really precise, within 2 and within 3, there is a huge range your decks can play at. But the important thing is, like, even if your decks, like, I can build a 2 that is quite strong. I can build a 3 that is quite strong, that use the game changers, don't use the game changers, whatever. But the thing is, there's a lot of the game changers just make the game about something that players don't want to experience. And so if I'm playing at a 2, even if I'm playing a precon, you're playing a deck that is a good amount stronger than a precon, if those cards aren't showing up, because of the 4-player dynamic of the game and the fact that you have those multiplayer politics, it can still balance out pretty nicely. A lot of the things about the game changer list is how they impact the games they're played in, right? Like if someone plays a Risk Study or a Smothering Tithe, it just changes the shape of the entire game.
Yeah,
and it often gives that person an unassailable advantage, right? If you have a Smothering Tithe that is unchecked, you can solo 3 other players. So my hope is that while there will be some amount of people will default to 2, 3, and 4, I think a lot of the time, especially 2 and 3, I'm okay with that. And I think once again, the language, the tools that we're giving you to talk about that is helpful, because you can say my deck is a 3 and I have 0 game changers. My deck is a 3, I've got 3 game changers. You can say my deck is a 2, but I'm playing 1 game changer. Is that cool? It just gives you more stuff to talk about. And like I said, anytime we can convince you to have that conversation at the beginning, incentivize you to have that conversation at the beginning, I think the better it becomes. But we'll see. Like I said, we've never tried anything like this, so we'll see what happens when the rubber hits the road. So yeah, I guess we're all going to find out together.
So my personal experience in going through my decks, having seen this game changer list, I actually don't think it's going to be an issue. At least it wasn't for me. I went through my decks like in the past. If you're talking the 10 bracket system previously, what's a 6, what's a 7, like that always felt very nebulous. I went through my decks and I'm like, okay, a lot of these are 2s or 3s, and based on the Game Changer system, a bunch of them have Ancient Tombs in them and nothing else. Well, this deck clearly feels like a 2, so I'm just going to take that Ancient Tomb out. Well, this deck clearly doesn't feel like a 2, so I'm going to leave it in. And it was a very easy decision. I really didn't have spend a lot of time thinking about it. It was just like I looked at the deck and I could tell right away, like, this is playing at this level and this one is playing at this level, and that was an easy choice to make. So for me at least, it didn't wind up being difficult at all.
Yeah, I mean, we don't want to do anything that we didn't try ourselves, right? So we try to exercise with our own decks. We're like, hey, let's run this experiment. Let's try looking at our deck, seeing what we would do. And we found it, much like you, actually pretty straightforward, right? You let's look at a deck. If it's got any game changers, you're like, which end of the spectrum do I want to play on, right? Do I want to play on that end that has more tutors? And do I want to play on the end where some of these cards will be showing up, or do I not? And then from there, it's a pretty easy, we found it at least, a pretty easy decision on which direction you want to take your deck. And then the thing I love about it is, look, if it means a lot of people are like, well, I've got my one Ristic study, I'm just going to pull it out of this deck. To me, that's actually a huge win, right? That's like, great. If there's fewer Ristic studies and cyclonic rifts on the casual commander tables, I think that's good. It just lets more cards breathe. People are always talking about how they'd love to see less homogeneity in commander decks. And this is a great way of like, hey, those 2 or 3 cards that you're putting in all your blue decks because you felt like you had to, right? You're like, okay, well, I mean, I guess I better play cyclonic rift because it is the best thing I should do. It's like, no, you don't have to worry about that anymore. You don't have to play cyclonic rift in these decks. It lets you do something different, right? And bracket 3, I've had a lot of fun with like the menu of like, ooh, I could play up to 3 of these cards. Which ones do I want them to be, right? And there's a good amount of fun to be had there, right? Or if my deck had 4 bracket cards, ooh, which one do I want to cut? So I think there'll be some good discussion there as well.
I like the approach of the menu of game changers that you can put into your deck. So speaking of game changers, so I have a few numbers for everybody out there. And Gavin, I know you and I have gotten to talk about this a little bit. So 52% of decks as of January 2025, over half the decks out there are running 0 game changers. Combined 33% of decks contain anywhere from 1 to 3 game changer cards. So that kind of puts them in that 3 range. And then approximately 15% remaining of that are running 4 more game changers. So kind of 15% of the population out there is running that bracket 4 or 5 level. So with that said, do you think that's going to affect people's opinions? You mentioned you're kind of incentivizing people like, oh, I only have 1 game changer, maybe I'll take it out. Are you worried about the inverse, though, of people seeing, oh, I only have 1 game changer in here, I may as well put 2 more in?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to say, when I saw those numbers, so we worked on the system for a long time, and then we've been in touch with EDHREC, and you guys have been awesome in sending us information. So big shout out to the whole EDHREC team. They are phenomenal. When I saw these numbers come in, I was like, this is literally pretty close to perfect. Like, if I was to look at what I expected and numbers we chose of like 3 game changers, half brackets 1 and 2, 33% having some game changers, and 15% at the higher levels is literally like I was drawing up on a whiteboard like about how many people I expected to be in each category, and that was like near perfect. So I got to say, it was pretty amazing that the data lined up that way. I do think it'll change some people's habits. Absolutely, I think some people will look at their decks and tweak them slightly. Like there's some folks who are like, oh, well, I looked at my deck, I looked at the list, my deck is a 2, great, we're good. And there was some people that like look at their decks and it's like, oh, like what Dana was doing, I'll cut a card or add a couple cards. I do think that will happen. And I think to your point, if people with 1 game changer who want to play at a higher level are like, I'm putting 2 more in, that actually can be a good thing because it helps people all have a mean of playing against each other, right? Like if part of the challenge is,
sure,
your decks are mismatched, well, and these are some of the strongest cards in Commander, we think, well, allowing you to become a slightly more matched that way, to me, sounds like potential upside. Now, we'll see how it actually plays out, but I don't mind if someone's like, oh, I think my deck wants to be a little bit stronger, I'm going to include 2 more game changers. I think that's totally fine. And I think on the flip side, there'll be a lot of folks who are like, exactly what Dana did. I've got 1 game changer. It's not really that important to the deck. It's just like a cool mana piece or something. I'll just take it out and play fair. And that reduces the amount of times you're going to have those, Ancient Tomb Soul Ring draws that are totally run away with the game. So to me, I think that kind of equalization and that kind of leveling off within a category of expectations is pretty useful. Now, within bracket 3, I can put 3 game changers in 2 different decks and have 2 decks that are still very different powers from each other. So there is some amount of knowing what your deck is capable of. There are plenty of bracket 4 decks that I would say have 0 game changers in them, right? Because they're just because they're a super linear, powerful typo theme or something like that. So kind of one of the things we did is you can always bracket yourself up, right? Like if you have the self-awareness to know, hey, my deck is really powerful, I should be playing at a bracket 3 even though I've got no game changers, you have the ability to do that. but you can't bring yourself down, right? You can't be like, oh, I've got 5 list cards in my deck. My deck's actually a 2. Like, that's not happening. So because so much of it again is controlling for the game experience that you want, and some folks just don't want the Rhystic Study, some other type of Cyclonic Rift game experience.
So this system is, I guess, somewhat complex in that, we're looking at a banned list of cards and the implicit list of land destruction, disruption cards, and now as well as the game changer list. Is there anything you're worried about being kind of overlooked here in terms of how people classify their deck or classify how they're going to bracket it or how they're going to play?
Yeah, we've really tried stripping this down pretty far. It is a heck of a far cry from the like, hey, look at every card in your deck compared to these tracking lists that we've got. We got down to really one list to look at with some heuristics and deck building rules. Complexity is certainly a thing that's really on our mind here, right? Like, no one's ever tried anything like this, really. We've certainly never tried anything like this. And it's possible there's some amount of people that they're just like, I don't want to look through this. It's too much. I'm bouncing off of it. Now, I put like even a recap in the article that's really short and sweet for you to look at. We're going to, I think, have a one sheet at Chicago that you can look at when you enter the command zone of like, oh, here's some heuristics to look at. So, we got to the point where we can fit it all on one piece of paper, which is really nice. But we're going to have to see how people react to this. My hope is it's like where you can look at this at the 5 brackets and understand where your deck falls pretty fast. And then the game changers list is short enough and full of cards that you would expect to be there enough that it is approachable, but we will see. Like, we'll find out as people investigate it. I know, like, once again, I ran the exercise of showing it to folks in the building, including people who are not super heavy Magic or Commander players, and the fact that they could look through and quickly identify what kind of decks they wanted to play was a really good litmus test for me. So we'll kind of see, but everyone loves a good personality test, right? Like, if I'm like, hey, which Ravnica guild are you? You will happily sit there while I tell you all 10 Ravnica guilds and then tell me, oh, I'm Azorius, or whatever the case is. And I think, like, in this case, when I rattle off the 5 brackets of, hey, bracket 1 is super goofy, play your thematic stuff. It's not about winning, it's about sitting and having a fun time with your really thematic deck. Bracket 2 is about a precon power level. Bracket 3 is above a precon power level. You've made your deck stronger. Bracket 4 is high power commander. The gloves are off, you're battling each other. 5 is CDH. I think if I just say that to you, I think most people will know where their deck falls. Mm-hmm. Now, is there more nuance in that? Yes, there's some guidance around tutors and mass land destruction. But I think if I say that to you, 90% of the time, you will understand where your deck falls and you'll be pretty right. And maybe you make 1 or 2 tweaks to it. But I think if you just look at that heuristic, you'll end up in the right place pretty quickly.
So say there's players out there like Dan who they took Ancient Tomb out of their cards and then they kind of use that as maybe a shield. Because Gavin, you mentioned that maybe sometimes people will be like, well, my deck is still a 4, but even though it doesn't have any game changers in it. Do you think there might be maybe a weak point almost in that people might build a deck that could be a 4 and then justify it as, well, my deck doesn't have any game changers in it, and therefore they think it's a 2 or 3 and play down a little bit. Are there any kind of weak points that you focused on when creating the system that you think might help players to be aware of and maybe be vigilant about in their pregame conversations?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we talked a lot about that exact thing, right? And people having to do a bit of self-identification. Mm-hmm. Bad actors, we decided early on, like, hey, we can't stop bad actors. But some people out there are just like, sure, hey, in good faith, I followed the rules. I have no game changers or whatever. And that's really where those descriptions of each bracket really came into play here. Mm-hmm. Because if you build your deck with no game changers that are still, comboing people out on turn 4 or some whatever, and try and play that in bracket 2, well, bracket 2 is like an average precon experience. You're not getting comboed out on turn 4 an average precon experience. Mm-hmm. So our hope is that by creating a description which talks about what to expect there, plus list, that kind of double approach really goes a long way, right? If you think about, kinds of Magic players, I think there's one group that really loves having a clear list to look at. They're like, I love having a list to follow. There's clear rules. And there's another group that really enjoys having reading the philosophy and the descriptions of what should be going into decks. And I think that this gives both people something to latch onto, and hopefully they can look at a little bit of the other side to understand what goes there. So yeah, in every bracket, it talks about the description of what happens, and then the rules of bracket 2 is low tutors, no mass land denial, you should not be chained together extra turns, and no game changers, right? And between those things, if you're a player who really enjoys reading a list and categorically understanding, I think if you follow those rules, you'll be in a pretty good shape to be in a bracket 2 situation. Yes, I can construct decks theoretically that are not that do not follow those rules, but I think the vast majority of the time, if you follow those rules, you'll be in pretty good shape, even without reading the description. And then hopefully the quick sentence of, it's about an average precon level modern day, will get you in the right headspace. So our hope is that double approach will go well. Kind of that almost like psychographic level plus the rule level. We'll see, of course. That's what we believe, but we'll see what happens if people actually try it out.
that consideration that you gave to both people that need the hard and fast rules and then they need something a little more descriptive. I'm glad that that's there. I very much appreciate that kind of thought process. It's making sure to cover all that, because I think one thing that might get taken advantage of just in the abstract is you mentioned 2-card infinite combos with several of these brackets, but you don't mention stuff that aren't maybe definite win conditions or they are lock pieces. I think the example here that was like the Mycosynth Lattice Karn Liberated combo, that it's not mass land denial so much as it's just hard locks. And so kind of the situation where things that still aren't maybe clarified very well, hard stacks pieces, I think maybe I personally would have kind of emphasized that a little bit. Where did that kind of come in the thought process for you in the group then?
Yeah, absolutely. There's always a struggle between like making sure things were simple and understandable versus adding too much. Like we could have added a category that's like no stacks pieces, but okay, well, what are stacks pieces? What defines a stacks piece?
Then you get another list too. Then yeah,
and then you get a whole nother list you have to look at. So our hope is that the descriptions will help out there a little bit. And look, if someone is trying to Mycosynth Lattice Karn the table, it should be pretty clear that's not happening in a bracket 2 situation. Like that is not a precon experience. And in the FAQ, I talk about this a little bit, but some of it is about intent. We wrote down like no intentionally infinite combos, because how many times have you picked up a commander deck you built, you intended to put no infinite combos in there, and then halfway through your first game, you're like, oops, guys, I accidentally like have this thing that wins the game here.
I have done that, yes.
Yes. And then, you learn from it and you pull that card out of your deck. So there'll be some amount of that, and that's totally fine.
Yep.
And there'll be some amount of like, I accidentally blew up everyone's lands. Also, Commander is a game where 4 players are playing with all kinds of crazy cards, right? If one player plays a card that animates all lands, and another player plays a board sweeper, that's not like, wow, you broke the rules. That's just like, well, that's what happens in Magic, right? We play different cards and things interact.
Sure.
But it's a lot about what you're intending to do with the game. And I do talk about that a little bit in there. When it comes to things that are not technically infinite but hard lock the game, yeah, maybe that's something that gets written in the future. I would hope that many people realize you should not be hard locking the game. That very much falls into like infinite game winning combo situation.
Yeah.
I think it's defined as like 2-card infinite combos. Perhaps that description should extend to 2-card combos that essentially end the game. So yeah, that's a fine note. Great example of getting community feedback in, and we'll look at that as we refine things. Maybe that turns out to be an issue. Maybe it doesn't. But if you want to game the system, we're well aware. If you want to game the system, there are ways to game it. Right? That is the nature of a system. Gamers. I'm also talking to a bunch of gamers who are going to game. But my goal is people that earnestly want to find a good match. If they read the descriptions, they'll be able to do that. Now, if you read the descriptions and your goal becomes, how can I game the system? Well, then suddenly, what are we even doing here, right? You're like,
right.
Like, is your goal to be able to lie to your friends about how strong of a deck you made? Well, I can't help you in this case. So really, there's a lot of people out there. There's a small segment of folks like that, don't get me wrong. But there's a lot of people out there that I think just want to be able to read something and earnestly and honestly find an appropriate game match of Magic that this will hopefully help out with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I definitely appreciate that answer. And I think to toot our own horn too, Commander Spellbook is a tool that we talked about several times on this podcast, a way to kind of proofread yourself. And I'm sure that we'll make sure that functionality with the game changers is added to Commander Spellbook. Because like you said, sometimes you oops into those situations. I've done it before with a couple decks because there's just so many interactions. So yeah, I'm sure just having those data points, it's going to be super helpful. And yeah, I'm just making sure we get all the feedback, all the questions asked, because even though I personally don't believe it, we want to make sure we're asking you the questions for the community too.
Yeah, 100%. I appreciate that. And ultimately, look, we all know Magic community is, of course, a bunch of people who like playing games. Mm-hmm. Games have rules. There's plenty of people out there who are like, I followed the rules. Here's my deck. And there are ways you can follow these rules and still end up with a deck that is a little bit outside the range. But my hope is for the vast majority of people trying to find games, they'll be able to use this to hone in on something better. And even if it's not perfect, I think it's still a heck of a lot better than power level 1 through 10. So hopefully it gets you to a good spot.
Yes, yeah.
So in going over the game changer list, we had a couple of cards that dinged between the three of us that we were surprised to not see on there.
Yeah.
Mana Drain was one that jumped out. Maybe Teferi's Protection. But were there any cards among that list, or just in general, that like you personally would have put on there, but the group in general didn't come to a consensus, or vice versa?
So we have an extremely long list of cards that we talked about that did not make it. In fact, one of the things we did at one point is we all submitted every card that you thought could possibly be on this list, and then we voted down all of them to see how everyone voted on every card, right? Even some stuff that is really far out there, really far afield, like Divine Intervention, which can draw the game, which I've never even seen cast in the game of Commander. But it was like we looked at tons and tons and tons of cards. So yeah, whatever, Mana Drain, all cards that were talked about, and decided to leave them off. Mana Drain was actually one that was pretty on the line, but ultimately kind of I think where that card landed a little bit was it can accelerate you for a turn, but it's a counterspell plus ritual. Neither of those things are like inherently a problem. You still have to spend mana on it, so maybe it gets put on there in time. Obviously, don't be wrong. We all know Mana Drain is an incredibly powerful card, but you know, we want in an effort to keep the list smaller. Like if we want to make a 100-card list, there are other cards we would put on it too, right? But you know, we had to really try and scrutinize every card's position. Mana Drain didn't quite make it. Mystic Remora is an interesting one, and that it's kind of most strong at the highest power levels of Commander.
Sure.
So, you know, we talked about it being on. It was debated. We ultimately left it off. There's a couple cards that were pretty hotly debated. The last one, the ones we cut, was the blue Narset, right? Because it is just so brutal with wheels. So, you know, there's some cards like that. The Great Henge is a card that was talked about plenty of just like, well, this is, you know, it's really strong, but ultimately you're doing really fair stuff, right? You're playing creatures and drawing cards. So does that count under a game changer? We'll see. Like I said, there's a very long list, and you know we voted and talked back and forth on a ton of them. I'll just say straight up, our list is not perfect. It is the thing that I feel most confidently I know we will be changing and adding cards or removing cards from. It's possible the whole system mostly works, and like you know maybe we put some tiny tweaks on things. But I can tell you with basically I would guess 100% certainty that when we come back in April, we will be moving some stuff around on the game changers list. Because we tried our best, and ultimately, and we were 16 people talking about this and debating it, plus people at Wizards talking about and debating it. But Commander is the biggest format in Magic. A lot of people are going to have opinions, and you know, I'm sure a lot of folks will be digging into data and talking about this kind of stuff. So we used our best information we had and our best thoughts to make decisions. But ultimately, folks are like, please put on the Great Henge, or please take off Force of Will, or whatever. That's all stuff that we're more than happy to do. The only thing that I want to be really careful of is how big the list gets. Now, maybe we'll release this. People will be like, we have no trouble with 40 cards. 40 cards, super easy peasy. But my guess is we do want to be careful about the size of the list for complexity reasons, especially when you consider, too, that if we unban cards, they're likely to go on this list, right? So the list will grow after any unbannings occur. So kind of forward thing with that in mind, it's already going to grow a little bit larger. How long do we want it to be at its outset? We'll see, but it's also possible it'll be like I guess I hate this metaphor because it doesn't actually real. This isn't true, but it's possible it's like a boiling frog situation, which doesn't actually work. Don't boil frog.
Yeah.
But where it's 40 cards to start. Oh, okay, everyone can accept that, no problem. And then you add in 5 cards here and 5 cards there and 5 cards here and 5 cards there. And a few years down the road, it's 60 cards, but the majority of Magic players have internalized it, so it's not an issue. Still a barrier to entry to new folks coming in, but maybe it ends up like that. We'll kind of see. I personally would like to keep it, 40 to 50 cards if possible. But we'll just kind of have to see how things all shake out.
Well, and like how you mentioned that, like, if you want to try to game the system, you can game the system, and like there's just no way to prevent against that. Mm-hmm. Similarly, you can kind of get a vibe check for some of this stuff, and that's one of the things I found myself doing when I was going over the list. Like, Mana Drain isn't on here. Yeah, but like it doesn't belong in this 2-power deck either. I could just tell the vibes based on, well, this technically Mox Opal isn't in here, but it doesn't belong on this particular deck either. So like, I would imagine people will find themselves doing some of that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that, Dana. I personally do the same thing. I think many players would do the same thing. With that said, to what I said about earlier, there are some section of people that is like, I need a list. If it's not on the list, it is eligible. They've thought about this. And so there's some merit to talking about listing those cards. Ultimately, if someone plays a Mana Drain in a bracket 2 game, it's like, okay, what's the outcome? My spell gets countered and they get +3 mana on their next turn, or +4 mana or +5 mana, whatever. That's strong. That's good. But is it going to dramatically ruin the game? I think a lot less likely than a Cyclonic Rift or something along those lines.
Sure.
But we'll have to kind of wait and see. Like Mox Opal and Mox Amber were cards that were certainly a bit of a conversation, because Chrome Mox, Mox Diamond work in any deck. Mox Opal, Mox Amber are a lot more dependent on the kind of decks you're playing. It's like Mox Opal's very strong. It should go in most artifact-focused decks, but is that good enough on its own to put it on the list? And we opted for no, but I can imagine a world where we decide to put that on and just put all the fast mana on there. Originally, we actually had fast mana as like a category, much like how extra turns and so on are. But the problem with fast mana is it's so much harder to quantify. Like, is Jewel, what isn't fast mana is there's a card called Jeweled Amulet, I think, or something from a really old set. Ice Age, right? Where you can like tap, put a counter on it, and the next turn tap to get a mana out of it. And it's like, I don't know, would you count that as fast mana? Some people would count signets as fast mana. So we're like, okay, what about all cards cost 0 and 1? But then does Birds of Paradise count as fast mana? And you start to get into these conversations.
Sure.
Also, when you look down the list of cards we really wanted to hit, there were so few of them. We were like, let's just put them on as game changers and let you just do what you want, right? And so we hit Lion's Eye Diamond, which I guess is not fast mana, but it's just broken mana. We hit Chrome Mox, Mox Diamond, that kind of stuff. Ultimately, though, once again, a lot of the stuff is compounding too. So like when you build your deck, you're like, great, I have all the fast mana I ever want. And I put Mox Diamond and Chrome Mox and Ancient Tomb and Mox Opal all in my deck. Those cards begin to compound each other into really fast starts. Mm-hmm. But if you're playing your artifact deck and the only fast mana you really have is Mox Opal, it becomes less of an issue, right? So there is an issue of gradation there. So we'll see.
So what do you think, all said and done, what is the failure of this system? What would a sign of that be for you? Would it be just that it doesn't get any traction and players don't really adopt it very much? Or is it getting misused or anything else? What would that just kind of look like in your mind that this wasn't a success?
Yeah, well, I'd say, so here's some failure points for me. The failure points for me are, first of all, the most obvious one, nobody uses it, right? Like if we announce this thing and people are like, nah, I'm good, I'm just going to ignore all of this, well, okay. That's a failure. I kind of doubt that will happen. I expect this to be like some of the largest news in Commander in a long time. Folks will try it out and give us feedback, but that would be a failure point. I think a more realistic failure point is looking ahead, 9 months or 6 months or whatever. If everyone's like just adopts, we all just play 3, to your point earlier about gravitating toward the middle, and every deck is a 7. If everyone's like, oh, all of our decks are 3s now. We all agree we play 3 game changers. We all agree we do this, but very quickly it becomes clear that there's very different power levels of things going on. That sounds like less than ideal to me. I, once again, kind of don't think that will happen. I feel like we've given enough gradation between the 5 brackets that you'll kind of find where you live. But yeah, if everyone gravitates to exactly the same thing, and all the decks are not well match made within that same thing, that sounds like a failure to me. But with all that said, this is a beta for a reason, and I'm hoping that anything that would make it a failure right now, or something like that happens, we can then go back and make tweaks to make sure that isn't happening, right? And I'm not opposed to tweaking this thing. Like, let's say we roll it out and it's 75% good and 25% problematic. I would be happy to go back and tweak that 25% to make it more of a thing players want. So it's really only there is a world, we've talked about this, there is a world where like we launch this and no one wants to try it and adopt it and it falls flat on its face. That could happen. And if that happens, it'll be back to the drawing board on everything. We'll have to rethink everything that we've done, or if we want to approach this kind of thing at all. But my expectation and hope is, given how many people have showed this to, who have been like, I get it, I understand it, I'm willing to give it a try, is that a lot of this will mostly work and a bit of it won't work and we'll have to change it. And if I knew what the bit of it that wasn't going to work was right now, I would fix it, but I don't. So I have to wait for it to come out and to find out. I think the most likely thing we will have to change is the game changers list. I expect that there'll be cards on there that should be on there and cards cards that aren't. That's the most likely thing I think we'll have to change. And then the other thing I think is most likely is some of the categorization around what goes in each bracket might need to move around. Like, oh, maybe extra turns shouldn't be here. Maybe we need a separate category for fast mana or hard locks or whatever. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if some of that was true. But that's what the beta's for, right? That's why we're rolling this thing out as a test. Yeah,
well, like you say, with card design, there's a lot of levers that you can dial in and play around with. So I'm excited to see what you come up with that. And I'm sure MagicCon Chicago, I think the 3 of us are going to have a conversation in a month, and it's going to be very, very different about this.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to do another show in a month from now, and we can talk about how everything played out and what we're thinking going forward,
there we go.
On the books. Let's do it.
And to speak for myself personally, I went through and printed out new labels for my decks, and I already have the bracket on my label. Wow. So personally, I seem to be convinced that it's going to be something I'm going to use and am pretty happy with. So I've liked what I've seen of it thus far.
I'm really excited to go to Chicago and just see people coming with decks of a few different bracket levels and hoping it helps them navigate the pregame conversation. I love your label idea, Dana. That's awesome, right? I can imagine people do that with their deck boxes. So yeah, I mean, we will learn a lot. We will see how it plays out. But I'll say, like, after a lot of iteration, a lot of talking, I am optimistic. I really am optimistic about this. Even if it's not perfect, I do feel like there's enough here to give people the tools they need to talk about their games, which at the end of the day is the most important thing. Like, the goal of this is not to get you to use our system. The goal of this is to get you to play a more a better match-made game of Commander. And even if you don't use the exact system, if you are using things that get you to that, if pieces of this help you have those conversations, that's a huge win in my book.
Yeah, it very much feels like, despite this fact that the system is a little more complicated, it simplifies classifying your decks, which seems like doesn't make sense, but it does. It seems that this is a much simpler way, at least for me, in my experience thus far, for me to classify my decks than we had previously, despite the fact that the brackets are a little more complicated by adding in this additional list.
I think maybe like what you're getting at there and what you're seeing is it requires a little bit more upfront work. Like you had to look through your decks and decide, is this a 2 or a 3 or what have you. But then once you sit down at the table, it's just as fast as, or if not faster than power level 1 through 7. It's like, hey, I want to play bracket 2. Great, we got our decks. Let's play. Yeah. So it does require a little bit of upfront work, but I hope we didn't make it too onerous. I think there's one list to look at, some descriptions, and I really think like for most people, like they'll feel in their heart kind of what it is fast. Like, don't lie to yourself. If you're like, oh, is my deck a 3? No, you'll know in your heart. What it is.
When I think a lot of the deck building tools out there like Architect, we're working to make sure that the system is in place and make that system as seamless as possible. We want to give the system as best of a chance to succeed as we can. And so I know that that's one thing over at Architect they are working hard on. And so hopefully some of that upfront work that you mentioned, Gavin, is alleviated just because the tools that we have available are able to accommodate this. And this is again, tools like that need something hard and fast to point to, and we have that. And so hopefully people are able to adopt it pretty quickly and easily.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I felt was really important, and the whole group felt was really important, is like, hey, if we're going to make this a thing, first of all, let's work with the community on it. Let's use the community tools, because it is Commander's a community format. Let's loop everybody in. Mm-hmm. And B, it needs to be where your tools are, right? And so I'm so grateful to folks like, you at Architect and Scryfall for helping implement this pretty quickly. I don't know. I mean, you can tell me, Matt. Will the feature be up by the time this article goes, or at the time this video goes live?
Feature will be out by the time this episode goes live. We are locked and loaded. So it's exciting time because it's getting to work with you behind the scenes a little bit has been super exciting. And so we're glad that you thought of us to keep in mind and make sure that the player base at large is able to succeed in using this and adopting it too.
For sure. I mean, I'm a big community guy. We have an amazing community of Magic players. Commander's a community format. So I figure the more people I can loop in and make sure that, hey, let's have all the tools ready to go. Let's be all aligned so we can launch this thing all together. I think the more awesome it's going to be. And, we're recording this before Tuesday happens and we announce this thing. But I'm really hoping on Tuesday, it's kind of this really neat moment where everyone feels like, hey, there's this new thing. And it feels very organic. Like, yep, and Scryfall is updated and Architect is updated. And it's here, and it's a Wizards of the Coast and community partnership, which I personally think is really cool, and I'm really excited about.
Same, yeah. We definitely appreciate you, not just coming on the show. We definitely appreciate that too, but just being able to, like you said, have this be a community project that everybody comes together and really just it benefits so many players along so many aspects of Commander. And you mentioned beautiful. I think that's a really good word to use because it is kind of cool just seeing what we can do when we all get together and just put our minds in, like, make sure this thing is done right.
Yeah, and look, I've done some of this early, a little bit of this early by working with folks like EDHREC and Architect and Scryfall and so on. But now it's time for all of you, right? When I say it's a community focused thing, it's not just for the people around the websites. Now it's time to get your thoughts and your opinions, right? And the future of this system will be determined by feedback we get from people. So if you want to see tweaks, if you want to see things on the Game Changers list, if you're like, I love this but hate this, I hate this but love this, whatever, tell us. Please don't be afraid. As always, like, do so courteously. But like, tell us your stuff because we are listening. I am going to read every post I get about this on whatever social media network I'm on. I'm going to be at Chicago, trying to hang out in this area, talking to people. I'm sure I'm going to be watching and listening to so many podcasts and videos. Gonna have to 2x speed a lot of those guys. Sorry, but I want to absorb as much information on this as possible. So it's really. Whether you are a content creator or whether you are just a person with a Blue Sky account, tell us, right? Tell us your thoughts because it really is going to make a difference. And if you see me in Chicago, I'm often running around these shows trying to do a million things. But if you see me, feel free to flag me and say hi and tell me your quick thoughts, and I'm happy to take all that in. So I'm really looking forward to it.
Well, if people want to find you online for any feedback or if you have anything you want to plug, Gavin, what would be the best way to get a hold of you?
Well, the easiest way is just I have my name on social media pretty much everywhere. So whether you're using Blue Sky or using Instagram or TikTok or whatever, you can find me there. You can also, of course, I've got my own YouTube channel, Good Morning Magic. I'm going to have a video that goes out along with the announcement that I'll be talking through more or less what the article talks about. And you can always leave me comments on that video or on my videos there as well. And I will be seeing them and looking at them. So Yeah, that's it. I guess the last thing I'll say too, I know there is a section of people out there, there's some number of people who are like, I don't care about a matchmaking system. I just want cards to be banned or unbanned. Like that is, I've been waiting since whatever happened, since the last round of bannings happened. I've been waiting to see, will you please just get to that? And what I'll say is, I wanted to create this, I think it was really important. We wanted to create this matchmaking system because we think that is really critical. And to me, that is a step toward getting to those bans and unbans, because if the Game Changers list works out, that gives us a whole new tool, right? It's not just binary, this card is legal or not legal. It gives us like another tool for rolling into this system. So like I said, late April is when we're planning to come back with the updated system out of beta and any changes to the banned or unbanned list. I can't guarantee it's going to be late April, of course. If we get really strong feedback, we have to rework stuff. It may take longer. But ideally, we'll come back late April, and that's when that stuff will happen. So as I said earlier, Commander moves slow. We have time. I want to take the time to take everyone's feedback in and iterate on this stuff. But if you're one of the folks who is really focused on the literal banned list, come back in late April, and we'll hopefully have some news for you. And honestly, I can't tell you exactly what's going to happen. I don't know what might be coming off. I will tell you we're not going to be banning any cards at that time. We will only be unbanning cards. But how many cards and which cards, or if any cards at all, well that remains to be seen. So it is going to be an interesting and next discussion of this to figure out how we want to tackle that ban list. But if the Game Changers list goes well, my personal prediction is we'll be able to pull a number of cards off and put them on the Game Changer list instead. Right? There are cards like, I'll use my favorite poster child, Coalition Victory, which is, maybe it is a frustrating card to have at the lowest, at the lowest power levels, lowest brackets, where someone's winning out of nowhere. You could argue such a thing, but certainly at high-powered Commander, I don't think anyone's gonna be worried about Coalition Victory tearing up the scene. So that is one example of a card I think could very easily come off and keep out of the places where maybe some folks will be frustrated by it, but not be an issue in the bigger ones. Or if you want to try building your bracket 3 deck where you're going for the Coalition Victory win, that sounds cool to me, not like downside. So anyway, it'll be a lot of fun discussions to be had.
Yeah, I have a personal wish list of cards that maybe get brought up in discussions to come off the ban list, but I'm very excited to see what you get to working on, because it gives so many different avenues to release cards back in that aren't going to run rampant in places they don't belong. So I'm very excited for this, Gavin. And again, thank you so much just for coming on the show. We definitely appreciate your time and kind of giving light to a lot of these things that the community is, I'm sure, wondering right now.
Well, I know I'm no Joey, but I hope I could help out.
I mean, very few people are Joey. Nobody has the hair there, so
I certainly don't.
Very true.
Unfortunately.
Fair. Well, with that, Gavin, again, thank you so much for coming on. We're going to wrap this up and take off. But if anybody needs to get a hold of Gavin, make sure you reach out on socials.
Yeah, and I look forward to watching your video about what you want to see unbanned. It'll be useful.
And we're back. We are back, Dana. That conversation was so impressive. I just can't say enough about how just Gavin's approach to Magic as a format.
Yeah, so we had done a rec room right after the announcement that this was being handed off to WotC last fall. And one of the things we all kind of agreed on was we were a little bit wary, but the fact that Gavin was going to be in charge of all of this kind of felt like a relief.
It did.
And having then had this interview with him and not that I wasn't already convinced, but hearing how thoughtful he was and how much work went into this system, I'm pretty confident it's going to work out nicely for everybody.
Yeah, his perspective about just approaching Commander and the way he did it was very reassuring to me. I know that there's some feedback still that needs to get worked out. There's some criticisms, which it's nice that Gavin is recognizing that and saying this is a beta. There's still kinks to be worked out. There's still things that are going to change. But it's nice to see that he brought in enough voices from along the spectrum of what Commander is these days, whether it's the super casual all the way up to the high level CDH crowd. There's enough voices that are having some sort of way to give that input, give that feedback, and make sure it's a win across the board. And I think that is probably one of the things that's going to come out of this is it's a way to kind of accommodate a massive amount of players all at once.
And he, himself said this is basically a beta of this, and said that as much that they're going to be making changes down the road as they get more feedback in, just how open they are to adjusting things to meet what the player base wants and things they may have missed. It just is just reassuring. I already felt pretty good about the system, having tweaked it a little bit with my own decks, and just knowing that like adjustments can be made down the road and they are very open to that just makes me even more confident as this is going to work out nicely for everybody.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious what it's going to look like for me specifically, because, and players that kind of approach the game the same way, because I really haven't gotten a chance to process it as a player yet. And I'm curious if it's going to do the thing we mentioned with Gavin, where is it going to encourage people that are kind of on the border to move up or down with how many game changes they're playing?
Sure.
I have some decks are kind of on the border, and so do I move up? Do I move it to a level 3 and add a couple more game changers? Do I restrict it and take some out like you said you were doing? I haven't had a chance to really process it as a player yet, because like Gavin mentioned, we've been working with him a little bit behind the scenes in order just to make sure this was ready to go, to make sure Architect was set up to succeed and make sure players can put all these changes into effect right away. So once that all boils down, I'm sure after MagicCon Chicago, where we get a chance to play with other players, I'll have a better idea of how I'm feeling about it, but I am hopeful at least.
Yeah, I'm really curious to see if you had the same experience I had, where like you find yourself looking at your deck and it's just obvious which direction you want to push it. Do I want to pull this one card out and make it a 2? Do I want to add something else or leave it as a 3? It was easy for me, and I'm curious if it's that easy for you and everyone else out there for sure.
Yeah, and like we said, Architect is going to have all the tools ready to go for everybody. So by the time you're listening to this episode, Architect will be live with all the changes to handle this massive announcement. So if people do end up finding themselves moving up or down or one way or another, we definitely want to know. So let us in the comments too, just any feedback, whether it's for us, whether it's for Gavin, because we definitely get to forward that on and make sure that he sees all that feedback that we're seeing. So let us know in the comments what you all are thinking, because there's so many implications across the board as what this is going to do to the format. So hopefully it's all positive. I'm sure there's going to be a little bit of growing pains, but I'm excited.
Yeah, I am too.
Awesome. Well, with all that said, Dana, where can everybody find you on social media and find you just if they want to reach out with that feedback?
You can find me online at Dana Roach. I'm spending most of my time on Blue Sky lately. I write articles for EDHREC and Commander's Herald, and you can find all of us together at patreon.com/EDHRECast.
And you can find me on pretty much any social media platform at Mathimus55. That's MATHIMUS55. And don't forget, if you want some of the best ways to protect your cards, check out Dragon Shield. Those sleeves can protect anything, including your bracket 1 through 5 decks. If you need a color code, Dragon Shield has all the sleeves and all the colors that can help make that happen. So check them out. Check them out in the link below to support the show. And don't forget, you can find Joey at Joseph M. Schultz on pretty much any social media platform as well. But with all that said, it's time just to take off, because I don't know how much else we have left to say about this, because we're still trying to figure it out for ourselves. But with that said, make sure to EDHREC your deck before you wreck your deck.